Right. Hi, everyone. In this video, Gabby's going to give an introduction to 3D printing, how it works, why you would use it, and what it is. So thank you, Gabby.
Great. Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, so for this, I'm going to start by looking at why people use 3D printing in cultural heritage and similar areas. And basically, there's various things that you might use 3D printed copies, as it were, of heritage objects for. Many of which, but not all of which, fall into the category of pedagogical or public engagement. Right? It's very easy to imagine why you would want a physical copy of an object to give to students or to a member of the public to help them get a more of a sense of the artifact and its physicality and materiality and so forth, that they can't necessarily do. As researchers, we would obviously always want to handle the original if it still exists, but not everybody can do so. So you know, if the object is far away, you know, we can have copies of 3D objects that are in museums from the other side of the world, and we can have a little collection, and we can handle all of those. The objects are very fragile; they don't want to be handled by everyone. They may not be on display at all. They may be in stores. They may be hard to get hold of. We can create multiple copies of something, so you know, we don't necessarily have just one copy of a rare object. We can have as many copies as we like, as many as we have the patience to print. And they can also be disposable copies. 3D printing is pretty cheap. It's much more time consuming than it is monetarily expensive. But there's no problem at all if the object that you've created and you've handed around your class full of students gets broken, gets dropped into someone's glass of water, or they spill a drink on it, drop it on the floor. It's also a lot less likely to break when dropped on the floor than the original ceramic of a vase, for example, would be. And it doesn't matter if you know, a less scrupulous member of your audience slips into their pocket and you're not able to find it, and they run off home with it, which you know, has been known to happen at these sort of events. And if it's a 3D printed object, fine, I'll just print another. Likewise, engagement with the public, same sort of thing. You can talk in quite a hands-on way about the function of an object, the aesthetic of an object. If it's a pot, you can say, well, what would it be like to drink out of this pot? You can actually pour some water in it and see what it looks like. What would it be like to serve out of this pot? You know, can you make you know, a little pot and use it to flick water across the room and recreating an ancient Greek game with it, and so forth. This is part of heritage institutions' duty to the public, is engaging the public, right? It's educating, but also engaging and entertaining the public. And so, you know, being able to handle these objects is one of the things that 3D printing helps us to serve. This in the past might have been served, and even now, of course, might have been served by you know, creating using clay and potting, you know, pottery mechanisms to create, you know, crafting a pot yourself and firing it and so forth. But that obviously takes a lot longer than 3D printing, and you're not going to get an exact reproduction to the millimeter of the of an ancient object if you do that, or at least it would be a lot harder to do so. And so, as I say, the audience can get, or even as researchers, we might want to say, okay, I've seen this object, but can I get a sensory encounter with this object? Can I actually pick it up, see what it's like to have, you know, a vase of this kind held in my hand, held only by the handles, or, you know, held by the bowl? What are the various different ways in which you can hold it? All those sorts of things that you can have as an experience of encountering this object. On the flip side, the 3D printed object will almost certainly be a different color than the original, and very different texture, quite possibly a different weight. If it's made of plastic, it's going to be very different from an object made of ceramic or metal or stone or wood. So the sensory encounter is going to be imperfect. There's no question about that. There are issues of accessibility. 3D objects can give you more access to an object. So, for example, you know, it could be used to allow someone to touch an object if visual encounter with the object isn't their primary way of engaging with things. But again, we should remember that it's not a substitute for more direct engagement with the object itself. So we shouldn't say, oh, well, we 3D printed it, our accessibility issues are fixed. There's more to it than that, but it may be one part of that process. Another slightly more engaged way of thinking about how 3D printing helps us to deal with and to think about ancient objects and heritage objects is to have some experience of designing and making those objects. I know people who use in their teaching about ancient making techniques, they use 3D printing so that the students have designed and created an object themselves. Even if they haven't used the same techniques that the ancients would have, they've nevertheless had to think about function. They've had to think about, well, am I going to have a handle on it or not? Am I going to, and all these sorts of things. And how strong will it be if I design a handle, this thick, as opposed to, if I have a handle that I attach later and all that sort of thing. So you get to really think about that sort of thing. It can also be used as part of a thought experiment around experimental reconstruction of an incomplete object, a damaged or fragmentary object. Say, we don't know, because we don't have any examples of unbroken versions of this pot, exactly what its handles look like. So let's 3D print 4 or 5 different handles that might have belonged on it, and see how practical they are, and other kinds of questions that we might ask about them. What their aesthetic are, and that can help us with this sort of experimental testing. They can also create reference objects. They can be used to document the condition of an object. They can also document our interpretation of an object if we've partially reconstructed it. But one of the most important things not to forget, in my view, is the fact that if we have a 3D printed copy of an object, we can use it to play. We can use the design process, the building of it, the printing it itself, and then handling that object in fun ways, in unexpected ways. Somebody taking a 3D printed copy of a Greek prop might do things with it that we hadn't planned, and might have insights into it for that reason, or even just develop a connection to antiquity and heritage through handling it in that way. So it has all sorts of possible unforeseen benefits, which I think are quite exciting. And obviously there's many other things that one could use 3D printing for. You could 3D print in order to sell copies. You could all sorts of other possibilities. I'm thinking primarily of the research and pedagogical value of it here. So on to the question of practice then. How does 3D printing work? When we talk about 3D printing, we're mostly talking about additive 3D printing. There are other approaches, but the additive 3D printing is effectively you're printing each layer of the object. A layer is usually a fragment of a millimeter. A slightly crude object might have layers of 1/3 of a millimeter. A very, very fine object might have layers of 10th of a millimeter. But you're effectively printing layer upon layer upon layer. And as you can see on this slide, each layer has to have something beneath it. You can't print a layer halfway up the object on thin air, because if you start to print it, the filament, which is still hot and hasn't set yet, will just fall to the ground and will leave a very messy object. This has implications on the shape of your model for the object. Not all objects are nice and neat and pyramid shaped, that every part of the object has at least something beneath it, as we'll see in a minute. So the process, from our point of view, of creating an object for 3D printing is to start from the object itself, or from a model of the object. So here we have an object that we're starting to photograph. This is one of 70 or so photographs I took of this miniature Kylix in order to create a photogrammetry model of it. This is the 3D model in the process of being edited, and we can see it from various different angles. The underside of the object, note I had to artificially create that hollow in the bottom, because I didn't image the underside of the object. I could have done, but for simplicity I didn't. So it's a slightly artificial object, and you can also see from the granularity on the surface, this is a fairly low quality model. That turned out didn't really matter when it came to 3D printing. the whole object from the ends of the handles is only about 10.5 centimeters. It's a very small object. So this is the object in the 3D print design environment. You can resize it, you can rotate it, you can move it around on the bed. This is a 3D reconstruction of the inside of the 3D printer, so you can see whereabouts on the bed it could fit. You might add other objects to it or so forth. But basically, you set the object, and I set it to be 11 centimeters from handle to handle, so so that it's the same size as the original. And then I have to add some supports, because, as I said, you have to have something beneath your object, beneath each layer, in order to be able to print that layer. So it's okay if you've got something that is not directly beneath it, but is just slightly to one side. So those sloping surfaces along here are fine, because they're a steep enough slope that that one layer being printed above the layer below with a slight overhang isn't going to cause a problem for the printing. But these handles I could never have printed without these supports. So I print these supports, and then we'll cut the supports off after printing the object. And the thing to think about when doing that is that when you cut those supports off, you will leave imperfections on the surface of your 3D printed model where the supports were. So I'd originally thought I should print the vase the other way up, so the handles were closer to the bed and therefore needed less by way of support. But that meant that also the inside of the cup also needed lots of supports to hold it up. And the inside of the cup was then really ugly in the 3D printed copy, and it was imperfect, and there was a lot of rough surface, and that's the first thing people look at when you hand them a 3D printer. They look inside and they say, why does it look like crap? And so I then started the other copies I printed of this. I printed this way up, because the underside of the handles are a bit rough. That makes it a little bit less pleasant to lift up when you're holding it by the handles, but it looks a lot nicer. The 3D printer software then creates this this model, which is the printing instructions, basically. And this is literally saying where each bit of filament goes, at what speed the head should move, at what temperature the head should have heated the filament up until that point. And that includes printing a bed beneath it so that it doesn't slip on the surface of the printer, and where it should leave gaps in between printing, and where it can print more quickly, because it's not printing at high quality. The supports that I showed you and that you can see here on this object are printed very, very fast, at very low quality, because they don't need to look good, because you can chop them off afterwards anyway. And in fact, the weaker they are, the better, because then they're easier to chop off. Whereas the body of the object itself should be fairly sturdy and not have any holes in it. So that's the object. The file that this produces, which is a set of instructions for the printer, is basically a set of numbers. Well, I guess all digital files are a set of numbers, but it's basically just saying, start printing here, move in this direction at this speed, and then stop, and then move in this direction at this speed, and so forth. And it gives that set of instructions, and the printer will print it. An object this size, as I said, that is about 10 centimeters from the tips of the handles to each other, printed at fairly high quality on a relatively relatively low end 3D printer, takes somewhere in the region of 4 hours to print. Okay, so just to give you a sense of time there, that's what I meant by this being more time, and it probably costs, in terms of both electricity and filament, less than £1 at that point. But 4 hours of time is worth a lot more than £1 to me, in terms of sitting there and waiting for it. A couple of words just about that filament. The two main filaments types that one use to 3D print are ABS and PLA. They're the main domestic 3D printing materials you'd use. ABS is acrylonitrile butadiene styrene. which is a fairly hard plastic. It's quite durable. It's waterproof. You can use it to make, garden furniture or ornaments that you'll plant, plant flowers in or something. So it's relatively safe there, or things that you can eat out of. The print temperature is fairly high. You have to heat it to over 250 degrees Celsius in order to print from it. So it's a little bit more expensive from that point of view. It's a little bit more polluting because all the bits you have to chop off, they have to either go away and be recycled, or they'll live in landfill for thousands of years, as we know. The other filament type that we use, and this is the one that I use much more often, and we use much more often at the School of Advanced Study, is PLA, polylactic acid. This is biodegradable, not in the sense that you'd want to chuck it on your compost heap, but in the sense that it will degrade eventually. It only needs to be heated to about 200 degrees to print. You can print up to 220 degrees if you want to print a little bit more finely, but 200 degrees is usually fine. But you do have to be a bit careful. I wouldn't want to make a cup out of this and drink out of it, because it would start to degrade and you'd start getting this not particularly healthy for you residue of the object coming off in the drink. And if you used it for garden furniture, it would degrade over the course of a year or two, which you probably don't want that to happen. You can, of course, 3D print with all sorts of other objects. You can 3D print with other plastics, but also metals. Concrete can be used to 3D print. You can 3D print with an artificial form of wood that produces a wood-like finish. People have even 3D printed at very low temperatures, nice and cheaply, using chocolate to create edible models. And these are all obviously for additive printing that we've been talking about. If you're doing the sort of subtractive modeling, where you start with a block and the machine carves off the area you don't want to get to leave behind the model, then that can be done in all sorts of objects, stone and marble and whatever, as well, or a real piece of wood, etc. But that's not something we've talked about, and that tends to be a slightly more expensive technology. The relatively cheap 3D printer that I've used for the demonstrations in this presentation was about a £1,500 3D printer a few years ago. I suspect you can get even cheaper ones now that are not particularly expensive. And I know if you buy a kit and you want to make your own 3D printer at home, you can probably get them for about £500. So that's quite doable. And this is the object. This was actually a copy I printed on a slightly more expensive printer, the Ultimaker printer, with about £3,000, I think. But this is the object, as you can see, just after it's finished printing. I haven't yet chopped off those supports underneath the handles, and there are more supports underneath that foot that will need to be removed later as well, although you can't see them from here. And if we were in a classroom instead of on a YouTube video, I would have half a dozen copies of this object that I would then pass around, and if one of you stole it, who would care? Because you can just print another. So that's the basic theory.
Cool, thank you for that, Gabby.